St. Niemann, and this is Orthodox Christian Television. Joining me again today are Mr. Michael Halford and Mr. Timothy Fisher. Welcome once again, gentlemen.
It's good to be here again.
Thank you. On today's program, we're going to launch into a new series to discuss a paper of Father John Romanides entitled Original Sin According to St. Paul. Now, in reading this paper, I couldn't help but think of some questions, some very basic questions that our viewers might ask. And to start with, what is the human condition? Because he talks about this a lot and waxes forth rather eloquent sometimes in trying to describe it. Would one of you like to feel that, please?
Well, the human condition is fundamentally, from any Christian point of view, is fallen. It's how you define the nature of that fallenness that distinguishes the different Christian positions. But that's the basic human condition that we're faced with. Man is mortal. Man commits moral errors, does things that are unethical, and is not, in effect, pursuing his salvation.
So, in fact, he's pursuing what the fathers call the self-seeking happiness, which we've talked about in previous programs, is the sickness of religion, is the desire to appease God and to find a methodology and a rational explanation for self-enhancement and self-gratification.
But what does this have to do with St. Paul's ideas of original sin?
Well, according to the paper, John Romanides says that St. Paul sees the original sin in the Orthodox sense, not the Catholic sense. We'll talk, the Roman Catholic sense, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But in the Orthodox sense, he sees the source of our fallenness, which he defines as the effects of original sin, or in shorthand, as original sin. He sees that that original sin is responsible for all of the maladies, the moral, the moral failures, the self-seeking happiness, which Timothy's elaborated, just now.
Now, if someone were watching the program and had never heard of the term original sin, how would either of you define that?
Well, original sin specifically means the sin that Adam and Eve committed, which was the cause of them being cast out of paradise, and the curse of death, and having to work the land, and all the curses which came from that.
Childbearing pain,
yes,
and so forth.
And that is specifically what is meant by original sin. Now, from an Augustinian Western perspective, each individual person is responsible for the sin of Adam. So this guilt is transmitted from generation to generation, and each person, when they're born, stands guilty of that sin. Now, this is not the patristic understanding of the fathers.
Sort of like the person is born with that gene or something,
yes,
a mutated gene. Okay.
From a patristic understanding, from the Eastern Fathers, which we also consider the biblical standard, we're responsible in a sense because we bear the consequences of that sin, but we don't actually bear the actual guilt for that sin.
Do we have a predisposition toward it because of Adam's fall? Or
yes, well, we have this, our mortality, our fear of death, which John Romanides elaborates in the paper, is responsible for the spiritual condition which makes it possible for us to sin. Which, from a Western perspective, they see that death is a consequence of sin.
Sort of death is the punishment
for sin. As many Protestants may say, the wages of sin is death, and therefore we die because we sin. What I found elucidating about the paper is that St. Paul actually sees sin as the consequence of death. It's because we die and because we're mortal that we sin.
How else can we die? Isn't it an Orthodox understanding that when you are baptized, you die to this world, correct? Yes. So we're talking about two different kinds of death here.
Well, he's talking about predominantly the physical death, that man's fear of physical death is what produces this self-seeking happiness, this desire for security, and that all of the other sins, whether it be greed or the desire for self-aggrandizement, the desire for acquisition of things, that all of those have their source in this fear of death, this desire that we have.
The fear of physical death,
yes,
of this world. So, Timothy, can you elaborate on that?
Well, he stated it very clearly. It is this difference that is quite striking in this paper from the conventional Western point of view, and what Professor John Romanides is trying to do here is, in this paper, is answer basically those commentators and interpreters of St. Paul who are mistaking his message and trying to impose on it this Western point of view, and try to say that it is possible, for example, in this life to achieve, because there's a happiness, because there's inherent in the universe a certain moral law. And what Father John is pointing out is that in fact there is not inherent in nature or in creation this moral law. The devil is in fact dominating it through death. Death is the instrument or the means.
Now, which death are you talking about?
The physical
death. Okay.
Physical death. And it is in this way that, in fact, the devil produces in man's soul a spiritual death.
See, the major difference between the West and the East on this matter is that the West sees the author of death primarily as the devil and not as God. You see, from a Western perspective, we commit these sins, then God acts as our executioner and he orders our death.
It sort of creates a juridical approach to life in general.
Yes, and so, God is the ultimate purveyor of capital punishment. And from the Eastern perspective, death is the result of Satan's control of God's good created world.
Sort of being enslaved to sin, or those acts which take us further from God. Right?
It's actually the devil's creation.
Yes.
It's his...
Death is?
Yeah, death and sin and evil are really the products of what he would like to see the world become out of his original fall prior to man's creation, and away from God and away from grace. And he is now trying to involve man in that.
No, he's trying to literally take down as many people possible with him, in his own self-destruction.
I see. Oh, so how has I guess that's how the West has tried to explain this, yes?
Well, it's interesting because what the West says and how they paint, God is that he's sitting down there like a judge or a prosecutor, counting down every sin. And you have the Catholic notion, the Roman Catholic notion that he's got a gradation of sins. Some sins are worse than others. They have the mortal sins, and those he counts against you seriously. Then they have the venial sins, and those
like misdemeanors.
Yes, and our entire criminal justice system is based upon this principle. That there are certain acts, that there are certain acts that are deserving of death, and then there are certain acts that are deserving of confinement, and there are certain acts deserving of fines, and this projection of this concept of human justice is then projected onto God, and we think that God deals with human beings in much the same way.
That we do.
Whereas in fact Father John points out that you could actually, instead of the phrase the justice of God, you could refer to the love of God. And the Eastern conception is much more of a loving God who, even in the act of, shall we say, sentencing man to death because of his sin, is in fact, according to many of the fathers, doing man a favor. Because once man has fallen away from God, from life, from goodness itself, if he were to live in perpetuity in this state, he would be in perpetual misery. So what God is actually providing man is a chance to escape from what St. Paul calls this body of sin, the flesh.
Well, he also calls this body of death as well.
Or this body of death. And this principle, which has become a part of man's nature in the flesh, of mortality, of self-seeking, and all the other things, will in effect be eradicated, and man will be given a new body, and there will be a new creation. And so this is actually, in the Orthodox thinking, a sign of God's love, not a condemnation of man as a punishment, a retribution from the standpoint of some sort of offended God's justice or something of that nature, which is pretty much the traditional Western conception of what is described in Genesis.
And that's why St. Paul sees the resurrection, the physical bodily resurrection, as the ultimate defeat of Satan. Because as long as Satan has the power to wield physical death as a weapon against us, that we're subject to him. Just as you're being held in your house by an armed gunman, the wise and prudent thing to do is not to resist him. To try to comply as much as possible so he doesn't pull the trigger. The devil acts as a physical terrorist against us in much the same way. And so long as we have this fear of him killing us, we're going to basically be suppliant to whatever he wants us to do.
Because we fear physical death.
And so that if we transcend that fear of physical death, then no longer are we afraid of what the devil can do to us, and no longer are we motivated by these desire for security, desire for happiness, which he uses, which actually are a consequence of this fear of his power of death over us.
So, this is going to hit a lot of people between the eyes. What's wrong with happiness then? You're saying that to seek happiness is to allow yourself to be be controlled by Satan. Yes?
Well, think about it. I mean, if we take the analogy, it's only an analogy of a terrorist that has broken into your house and is holding your family hostage, and says, "Do this and do this and do this, and I will be happy, and I will allow you to live." And so you start seeking to do the things which will protect you from this villain.
You're doing his will.
You're doing his will, and if by doing this you do not die, and you seek a sense of comfort, and now you've reached a point of equilibrium, so to speak, where he's now able to, you're now able to live, you're now able to cope with this constant threat. That state of contentment the West calls happiness. But it's a it's a delusional happiness. It's a happiness which is a result of pushing this fear of death out of your mind, so you don't think about it anymore, so you don't deal with it anymore. But it's not an ultimate joy.
You haven't overcome death.
You haven't overcome death.
Yes.
So how does man overcome death?
Well, basically by means of Christ and his resurrection, because Christ is life, and when the life descends into the tomb can't hold it, and therefore Christ, in essence, transforms human nature and infuses in it the principle of life.
Does he transform it or bring it back to what it originally was?
Well, it's the beginning of a process which will take it beyond what it was originally. In its original state, according to the fathers, basically, human nature was kind of innocent and kind of neutral.
But was it, people talk about the nature of man, getting back to my original nature, and I think they ascribe a lot of physical sort of animalistic tendencies.
Well, the problem with most people's conception about what human nature is, they're taking fallen human nature with its corruptibility and its mortality as the norm.
How?
As the norm. Well,
What do you mean by?
physical as well as moral.
Meaning
the corruptibility after
that you decay when we die,
after die, or during life, and so on and so forth.
Cancer and this and that.
Whatever.
Or
It's
aging,
the normal
aging.
process of aging.
I see.
But the point is, most people today not having a religious point of view or a faith in the resurrection of Christ, consider the state of man to be the normal, this state that we are in now.
Pursuing happiness, and
as a result, we are pursuing happiness.
Yeah, well, carrying my analogy,
we're basically involved in egoism.
Well, carrying my analogy a little, stretching a little longer, if the terrorists came in and camped out in your house and spent like several years there, you begin to adjust to it. And you would begin to assume it's normal.
Yeah.
And that's the condition that we as human beings are in. That the devil has taken control of the, he's created his own kingdom within the created world.
So he's hired a lot of script writers, and they've written a bunch of stuff, and they've taken over the television networks and put it all on TV.
Yeah.
And,
so we assume this is the way things are always going to be. And we don't believe that there is actually a way out of this, that there is a way to transform human nature.
Sort of lost hope
well, we've lost faith.
Lost faith.
Lost faith, and as a result, we've lost hope and we've lost love. As St. Paul would say, these three are very much interconnected.
Mm-hmm. So I guess that answers the question of what is wrong with happiness as we know it in this society today.
We define happiness, unfortunately, in terms of ourselves.
Or in terms of, becoming comfortable with the status quo.
Okay, so if we want to become godlike and get back to this original nature, and Christ, through his resurrection, showed us how to do this, or showed us that this was possible, why can't man realize selfless God like kind of love?
Well, he has to die to this world, as the scriptures say. You have to no longer fear death. You have to be buried with Christ in his baptism and raised with Christ to the newness of life. You have to pass through your own crucifixion of self. I mean, these are terms which, anyone that knows anything about Christianity has heard myriads of times. But there's a literal aspect to this, that to be dead to the world means to no longer care what this terrorist that's taken over your house is doing to you.
And that's why the martyrs so willingly went to their physical death, I suppose, yeah?
And Father John points out in the canons of the Church, this is why those who capitulated out of fear of death to whatever demand was being made on them by some persecutor of the Church were under particularly harsh condemnation, because the early Church and the Orthodox Church has maintained this conception, understood that if you really believe in Christ, you won't have that fear of death, so there is no reason to be afraid of the persecutor. Even the pain involved is something that you can withstand because of the supernatural nature of the grace that Christ has infused into human nature. The West, unfortunately, considering salvation to be basically a matter of forgiveness and a juridical thing, in other words, a legal thing, where someone exonerates you but doesn't really alter your state, leaves you in the status quo. This is proof that somehow deep down in the West there has been lost any vivid and real sense of Christ's resurrection as the center of the Christian faith.
Well, that's why in many of the Western confessions, the literal physical resurrection is no longer important to them. They've spiritualized it because this whole understanding of how the devil rules us through this threat of physical death has left them. They have no capacity now to understand that this physical death is not normal. That it's not part of God's original plan of what we were supposed to be, and that there will be a complete restoration of our fallenness, which has both a physical and a spiritual component, and that man is a unity of body, soul, and spirit, and that it's not just our soul that's going to be saved. It's the whole person, body, soul, and spirit.
And this begins now. It begins by participating in the sacraments of the Church, and they make a physical difference in your psychological makeup and your actual physical makeup, and you begin to perceive these things as you participate in them more and more.
So, what is? How would you say that this Western misconception has manifested itself in society? You know, this Western error in the understanding of what Christ was really accomplishing through his resurrection.
As Michael said, the general conception now of a resurrection is sort of that it's sort of some sort of a memorial thing that happens, you know, in your emotional heart, that Christ is resurrected inside you in some way, but not really, not physically, not concretely, and so the result is that you get this idea that Christ is sort of an example from way back when, that you sort of live up to now.
Like that was then,
and this
but
is
it's
now.
not now, and we have to kind of change with the times and the fashion.
And you have to kind of make Christianity relevant, and so you use all kinds of cultural and literary and other forms of expression in order to make Christianity live again.
Well, it's like this.
It's putting the cart before the horse.
Well, it's like, you know, if these terrorists came and they camped out in your house for months upon months, all of your routines would change. You know, how you ate dinner, how you did everything, and in fact, what Western Christianity, rather than preaching the salvation and liberation from the terrorist of death, has made an accommodation to it, has learned to live with it, has learned to live within it.
How can we be happy? How can we make this fit in our life and our own personal agenda in the pursuit of happiness in the world?
And this kind of pursuit of happiness ideal, which is called by the old Greek philosophical term of hedonism, has a very lofty side to it in philosophical circles, where in the Western theological circles of the scholastics of the Middle Ages and Aquinas and these others, what you are achieving is this beatific or blessed vision of God, and this will make you happy. But it's sort of God's there and you're here, and you're not, you know, really united. You're not changed and transformed. It's just now you see that there's God out there, and so everything now is understand. And again, this is sort of some sort of an idea that the devil is really sort of the agent of God, who's just merely sort of his policeman, you know, down there in hell, sort of running the prison part of the situation, and God runs the sort of little garden part up on top, and it's this very nice, neat little static universe, and it's why people today have these misconceptions of what spiritual life with God is like, that it's going to be very boring, and you just sit there plucking harps with wings on clouds, and so they think it's this very dull existence, whereas in fact, according to the Fathers, it's a very dynamic, growing, transforming thing which is going to take human nature into realms where it hasn't even begun to experience yet.
And that's why St. Paul says in a number of his epistles, we will grow from glory to glory to glory.
Well, what is he talking about when he talks about glory? Define glory, how he uses it.
Well, glory is the uncreated energies of God, the manifestations of God's nature that we are able to perceive.
And we actually assimilate
and participate
in. Love, truth, goodness, these things. But these are not just concepts. These are actual.
Not scoring or storing up points and so forth to.
Well, this is an actual participation in God's person, not with his essence, but with his energies.
Michael, could you give us a recap of our last program?
Well, in the last program, we specifically discussed the differences between the Eastern Orthodox understanding of what original sin is versus the Western understanding, i.e. the Protestant and the Roman Catholic understanding. The Protestant and Roman Catholics see original sin as a guilt for which is somehow passed from Adam through successive generations, for which every person when they're born is responsible. And
they're born with?
With this guilt. That means they're born under this sentence and that we see in the Orthodox Church original sin as inheriting the consequences of Adam's sin, the curse, i.e. the the mortality, the corruptibility, the seeking after happiness. I also use the analogy of death reigning in this world like a terrorist breaking into your house, and we try to make an accommodation to this terrorist, and that is what we explained as happiness seeking, to try to make this situation in our house in which is controlled by a terrorist, to prolong our life.
Mm-hmm. And also our Western disposition to want to pursue happiness, want to pursue sort of everything we can get out of this life, rather than understanding that this isn't the life that we're supposed to be seeking.
That's
Correct.
right.
Okay.
And I think in this program we're going to deal specifically with where these ideas came from, and where the difference in the West arose, and why the West believes something different from what the East believes.
Would you like to start off, Timothy?
Well, apparently it all began with a mistranslation of a specific passage in St. Paul's letter to the Romans.
Or who mistranslated this?
Romans 5:12, and this was translated into Latin by one of the so-called doctors of the church in the Western terms, Jerome of Jerusalem. And in so doing, in mistranslating this particular passage, he in fact implies in the Latin that the Adam is the source of sin, in whom all have sinned, and that's in quo is the Latin phrase which translates the Greek epho, which actually should be translated because of which, meaning death, not Adam. And because of this mistranslation, Augustine got this idea that it was because of Adam in whom all have sinned, rather than because of death all men have sinned.
Which we explained in the previous program. The West believes that death is the consequence of sin.
Sort of God's punishment.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so if you don't do what I want, I will, you'll die tomorrow, or you'll die horribly, or something
Whereas in the Eastern Fathers, understanding St. Paul's understanding, believes that sin is the consequence of death, that we sin because we die, we fear death.
As in fact one Westerner very late and recently put it, it is because we are afraid of death that we are in fact subject to lovelessness. The fear of the end is the source of all lovelessness, this Westerner put it, which is already beginning to get towards the Eastern conception.
So, as Orthodox Christians, what should our focus be then? What if there's a lovelessness that the Westerners have, a fear of that? What should our focus as Orthodox Christians be?
Well, because we are not afraid of the end, because death has been overcome physically as well as psychologically or in any other way, we are in fact liberated. We are set free, and we can now begin to act and begin to actually concretely achieve what we have been commanded by the Lord to achieve, which is selfless love. As we explained in the previous program, one of the problems in the West is that they have lost the belief and the faith that man can actually accomplish this.
Well, there goes the concept of happiness, I tell you.
Yeah, because they basically have not understood that man is going to be transformed, and
that this transformation begins in this life. It's not postponed to some future.
And it doesn't just involve the soul. It involves the body and the soul and the whole man. And these are some of the interesting points that Professor John Romanides makes in stating that a lot of Western, both religious and non-religious interpreters of St. Paul, in line with the Augustinian dualistic conception of human nature,
now,
that there is
dualistic,
that there is a spiritual and a physical and these are very separate, and they're very distinct.
And they're at war, basically.
And they are, in a certain sense, they are at war. And they attribute this to again, certain terms in St. Paul, where he talks about sarkikos and physikos, in other words, the fleshly and the soul. And they put these two things in total opposition and don't realize that in both cases, according to Professor John, these are referring to the whole man. Because in order to accomplish certain things in the flesh, you have to use the mind and the soul, and in order to accomplish certain things that are of the soul, you have to use the body, because the two are inextricably intertwined.
Well, that sounds more like a Hebraic understanding.
Exactly.
Of,
it's a Hebraic understanding of these things from the Old Testament and other things, which, of course, St. Paul, being well-versed in the Hebrew Scriptures and himself Jew and so on and so forth, even though he was Hellenized, in other words, he understood the philosophical and Greek concepts, he was not limited to them. Whereas Augustine, unfortunately, because he did not really know much Greek and was limited to Latin and had background basically in Neoplatonic philosophy, which posits this kind of a dualistic view of human nature, imported these things into his understanding and interpretation of St. Paul, and these then were inherited by all of the West in the succeeding centuries.
So you think it's safe to say that this Neoplatonism, Neoplatonic Augustinianism evolved into a humanism in the Age of Enlightenment?
Well, when the West rejected Augustine's system, they did so still within the philosophical tradition from which he arose. Replacing this guilt, they began to literally just eradicate guilt. They said guilt is bad, whereas guilt was good to begin with, because it prompted salvation, according to Augustine.
Is Augustine saying that feeling guilty manipulates our behavior into being good, or something like this?
What he's saying, basically, is that if it's our guilt that motivates us to repent, and because we feel guilty, we then are moved towards God. The only remedy for this guilt is God's forgiveness. Mm-hmm. So from a Western perspective, the guilt is a good thing because it causes us to seek its remedy, which is Christ.
But as opposed to?
Well, as opposed to the Eastern notion that it's not guilt which motivates us to Christ, it's love.
Love of God?
Love of God, and a desire for God. Mm-hmm. It's, guilt, then you understand that this is still serving that self-serving happiness, i.e., I feel guilty and I want to cease to feel guilty, therefore I turn to God so that he can forgive me. So it's still that same motivation to preserve yourself from the wrath of God. Whereas from the Eastern Orthodox perspective, it's your love of God that motivates you, and your love of God that turns you towards him.
As opposed to this self-love
Yes.
in the West and so forth. Could you add to that, Timothy?
Well, basically, that it's a result, as a result of all of this guilt emphasis in the West. Then you have a reaction against it, as in fact the sense of a credibility gap emerges in Western consciousness about what their church is capable of doing for them. They begin to lose faith in the church, and the result is that you then have the growth of humanism and secularism and the Enlightenment concepts of man as basically being a good thing, a clean slate, and able to save himself, in other words, to transform society and himself.
Sort of an egotistical, self-centered view of the universe.
Well, imagine what would happen if you're in this house with the terrorist has taken control, and the terrorist says, all right, you can continue practicing your religion.
And?
And you can continue doing your rituals, you can continue, I'll allow you to do this, but don't get me upset because I'll still kill you.
But change just this little thing here, and then the mutations begin.
And he begins to tell you, I've taken over this house because you deserve it.
But you're going to argue with him and say, well, you think you've taken over this house, but
and
you
so that's
kill us if you want, but we don't care.
But see, that's the situation that the Western Church found itself in with this theology. That we have a church that it basically has capitulated to the terrorist. And the natural response, finally, if you endure this long enough, you finally say, I don't want your threats and I don't want your religion. And there's a complete rebellion against that structure, and you find yourself with the Enlightenment, with rationalism, with humanism. Because there comes a point at which you say, I don't think I deserve to die because I'm guilty.
Because if you think that that were true, you would start doubting your faith.
Yeah.
And so it sort of mutate into this other sort of humanistically oriented entity to preserve that intrinsic part of or nature, God's nature in your heart. And
see,
so
rather than
to survive.
But see, rather
spiritually.
rather than the Eastern response that you would tell the terrorist, I'm not afraid of you, go ahead and kill me. The West response was, all right, I accept the fact that I'm going to die. I deserve to die. Please make it painless and let me live a little while longer.
Yeah, and let me go to Disneyland first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And see, that's the distinct difference. And that's why St. Paul sees that the devil is cunning. He says that we know his thoughts, we understand his thoughts, and this is the game that he's playing. And that's why he talks about putting on the armor and fighting him and engaging him in the battle, not succumbing, not acquiescing. You know, like Harrison Ford in Air Force One, fighting the terrorists and taking back the plane. That's what Christians are called to be. And unfortunately, the Western Church capitulated. It gave in to this theology of terrorism, and we see the consequence. You have people that have embraced it and have become rabid proponents of man's guilt and man's total depravity, who basically they've now become what you would call, they've been co-opted and have become agents of the terrorists. And you have those who have rejected it completely and said, look, I may have to live under these circumstances. I may have to accept these circumstances, but I'm not going to like it. And I'm not going to cooperate. And I'm not going to go along with your religious game plan for me.
Well, Timothy, what can be said, ladies and gentlemen?
Well, it's a beautiful image and very, very vivid. But let's a little bit get back to the paper here. One of the consequences of all of these misinterpretations that begin with this one point is that a whole series of theological mistakes, as you say, capitulations to this status quo of death being unconquered, in essence, a whole group of theological points begin to emerge in the West, and you get the present day identity of Roman Catholicism. You get the ideas of predestination and election, and then you get their concept of who the Virgin Mary was and her role.
This predestination came from Augustine's understanding of it, right?
Of basically the fact that man was not a free agent, and that basically God had to do everything for him, and that mankind had lost his free will. In the East, this concept of man's independence and free will is never lost. Man must freely cooperate with God and work on himself by means of ascetic endeavor, in order to transform his nature. In the West, because in effect this whole theological point is indicative of a much deeper theological problem, a much deeper spiritual problem, that basically the Western Church feels that it can't really overcome death. It doesn't have the grace. It doesn't have the energies of God working within it. It begins to sense this is missing, and therefore this is all unstated, but you can see the effects of it.
Sort of like being a medic on the battlefield with limited means to
you've got no
deal with the wounded.
You've got no medicines. You
can't operate and take.
You've got no instruments to operate with. You can't cure the patient. So the end result is that instead of curing him, you give him a crutch. And send him on his way, a little bandaged up, but you haven't really changed anything. And the result is that this then leads to a whole, as I say, series of theological errors in the West. One of the most glaring examples, I would say, is their concept of the Virgin Mary and her role in man's salvation, and her assumption into heaven, for example.
Well, what is? Can you talk about what the Western Roman Catholic viewpoint is as opposed to the Orthodox one?
Yeah, basically because of this concept of original sin derived from Augustine, the West now has the problem of liberating the Virgin Mary from this inherited guilt. If she is going to be pure in order to conceive Christ, she has got to be pure of sin. And the most important sin to be pure of course, is this guilt or this original sin. So the result is that you have the dogma of her immaculate conception. She is conceived of as being without this original sin. But unfortunately, this then leads to other consequences, and one of them is that, in effect, she has been separated from the rest of the human race.
In other words, she didn't do it on her own. She was predestined to be
she was predestined
pure
to do it,
and the Mother of God.
And she is a different kind of being than the rest of us.
No, she's basically was born in the same state that Eve was born in, a pre-fallen state, which creates all kinds of Christological problems, because if she was in a pre-fallen state, then how could Christ have been born in a fallen state from a pre-fallen woman?
So that's, are you saying that that's how the West mended this?
Well, that's how it had to deal with the logical consequences of this original theological mistake.
And even modern Protestantism now has decided that they still like the idea of inherited guilt, but now they've developed a theory that it's only transmitted through to the fathers, to men, and that's how she avoided having it.
Wow, that's curious.
It's very interesting and novel, and so obviously not very scriptural. It's one of these gymnastic contortions that you have to go through once you've accepted a basic premise that is false. So the end result is that why is this important? I mean, why is the Virgin Mary important in this whole thing? And because simply that this has now affected what is the nature of Christ, and is he human or not human? He has now become something different from the rest of humanity, which is fine in their viewpoint, because they simply are not trying to transform human nature by uniting it with the divine. They're just trying to forgive it, leave it in its state that it's already in. But Orthodoxy has a much more radical conception of what salvation is.
Well, salvation is sharing.
It's not just buying off the devil or God by the blood of Christ,
him, right.
Or the appeasement and the atonement doctrine.
Well, it's not winning your freedom from the terrorist that's taken over your house. It's actually being giving in or dying to the world, and the terrorist or the devil having no more threat over you.
Having no more power over you.
No more power over you.
Well, so we finally dealt with the terrorist. So I guess we have covered that of the Orthodox understanding of the Mother of God too. Didn't the idea of the, or the Western dogma of the Immaculate Conception come in
Came
not
very
too
late.
long ago?
It became
19th or
official.
18th century?
It became very late in Vatican I in 1870. But the point is that it has actually been de facto a part of Latin theology for centuries.
Retroactive.
Yeah, since the Middle Ages, it's been basically a part of a great deal of Latin theology, and they just began to realize that they had to officially promulgate it as a consequence of what they were doing.
We've also, I guess we've overlooked that Augustine felt that the methodology for getting rid of this original sin was baptism. That it was in baptism that you gained your freedom from this original guilt.
You were washed of it.
You were washed of it.
Right.
And so he had a very literalistic, kind of mechanistic view of how original sin was eradicated. And so for him then, and for the West, the whole notion of an encounter with Christ through baptism, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, and the whole notion of the acquisition of the Holy Spirit were lost. The baptism simply became a kind of mechanical act.
A symbol of forgiveness.
A symbol of forgiveness.
And instead of being, as it is in the Orthodox Church, a symbol of death, dying to the world, dying to the flesh, and being reborn in Christ, which is very much what it is in St. Paul. He has many phrases talking about baptism and dying to the world, dying to the flesh, and living in Christ.
As many as have been baptized into Christ have been put on Christ.
A bit on Christ's passion of rejection of this world, and put on that passion of selfless, godlike love.
They have taken up their cross and followed him. And this is not just imitation, but this is actual participation and becoming, sharing in his nature, all of which is made possible by his incarnation and his union of the human and the divine.
In his person.
Right, in his person, through the Virgin Mary. So you see that it all makes sense. It's all part of a system that coheres. But the whole system falls apart, and the linchpin is taken out of it when you go to Romans 5:12 and you misinterpret that phrase and you create the concept of original guilt that Augustine did. And then the whole system falls apart, and you have to create a substitute system, which is what the West has been spending the last millennium trying to do. So you get these different theological trends and emphases and the rest of it, and you get a lack of cohesion in their whole theological system.
And it forces you to take passages out of Paul and ignore other passages which seem to say things contrary to what to what Paul originally intended when he wrote those letters.
I think we've covered the paper in its entirety, and I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, once again, Mr. Michael Halford, Mr. Timothy Fisher, for joining us on Orthodox Christian Television. And I would like to invite our viewers to visit an Orthodox church in the New York area. You can go to the Cathedral of St. Marcellus in Astoria, Queens, and you will see a telephone number and an email address on the screen, and please call us or contact us with any comments or questions of things that you would like to have clarified. But for now, I'm Vincent Neiman for Orthodox Christian Television. Please join us again.